Welcome, everybody, to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And, of course, that means some Smart Talk Radio is in your future. This segment's certainly no exception. Got a good one today, talking to Molly Knight Raskin. She is a Columbia School of Journalism grad, of which she can tell us many things. She's also reported for Scientific American, Mind, Psychology Today, The Washington Post, Baltimore Sun, spent some time with Jim Lehrer, on the NewsHour. Also has a couple of PBS documentaries to her credit. And just as importantly, I'm sure in her own life, she has a husband and 2 kids, and she lives in the fine Garden State of New Jersey. Molly, how are you, my friend?
Very well, thanks. Thanks so much for having me.
Indeed. Here's what we know. You've done a lot of these interviews, and we're going to tell everybody right now this will be the best one you've ever done.
I have no doubt.
Indeed. Well, listen. The work that you did is a serious one. It's poignant. It's called No Better Time, The Brief, Remarkable Life of Danny Lewin, the genius who transformed the Internet. That alone would be a story, but it is also tied, of course, to the events of 9/11. And they sound like disparate subjects, so we'll let you help tie all those together. Give us, first of all, before we get too deep into this, so tell us a little bit more about Molly, how you got into journalism, and why in particular, ultimately, this particular story caught your eye.
Sure. Well, I've been a journalist for my whole career, pretty much as soon as I could write stories. So even from a young age, I knew what I wanted to do. So started out my high school paper, my local community paper in Virginia where I grew up. Went on to college to work at the newspaper there, and then pretty much from then on, I've worked in a variety of fields in media, newspapers, as you mentioned some of them at the top of the program, TV and print, so both producing and writing, and it's just something I love. And what motivates me really is just a great story. And, you know, when you do it as a job and it's your career, it becomes something almost a gut reaction where you just know that there are good stories, there are sort of interesting stories, there are okay stories, and then there are ones that just seem almost stranger than fiction. They're so good. And those are the ones I love to tell. And I've never really written about anything specific. People always ask me what do I cover as a journalist. I've covered everything. I've covered politics, covered crime, I've covered art. But what I love most is writing about people and really trying to figure out what makes people tick and what makes them do the things they do. And really, which may sound naive, the main reason I went into journalism and became a journalist and was also not just the storytelling, but also writing stories that I believe can make a difference. You know, I think there's a lot of journalism out there today that's celebrity-oriented and, frankly, just pretty silly. And I wanted to write about things that could potentially change, even just one reader for the better, and sometimes more than that. And so that's really the most important thing to me, and partly what drew me to this story. So you asked how the story came to me. Again, a good story when you hear it. And somebody came to me at the 10th anniversary of the September 11 attacks, which was 2 years ago. A friend of mine said, hey, listen, there's a company in Cambridge, and they're looking for somebody to produce a documentary tribute to one of their coworkers who died on 9/11, and he was a really bright guy and has kind of a neat story. Would you be interested? And I said, oh, sure, let me think about it. And then I went home and I started reading about the subject of my book, Danny Lewin, on the Internet. And the more I read, the more I just couldn't believe the story was true. And more than that, I couldn't believe that we didn't know the story, that I didn't know the story. I was in New York on 9/11 and spent the bulk of that year as a reporter telling stories of people whose lives were lost. And it was a really rough year, and I didn't really ever anticipate going back to a story related to that day in any way. But what inspired me so much was not about the way that Danny died, which is a part of the book, on that horrible flight, but it was really the way he lived that motivated me to write a book. Finally say, I think this is it. This is the story I want to write in a book.
Molly, we want to dive real deep into No Better Time, but before we do, you were there that day. You were a journalist. Can you share with us a little bit where you were that day and how that day evolved and transpired for you, as a journalist, but just as importantly, maybe as just a human being?
Sure. It's a great question, and ironically, there's so much irony in the way the story came to me, and then also, as you know, in the book. But I've been a journalist for a long time, but I did decide to go back to school for journalism for a year. I was living in New York, and my first week of graduate school the first assignment was to cover an election, and so I set out the morning of Tuesday, September 11th, to report my first assignment for journalism school, and was, really excited with my notebook in hand and ready to go cover a city council election. And somebody called me and said, "Turn on the television." I lived on the Upper West Side at the time. And from there, the day really, it can still come to me. It's definitely faded, fortunately, over the years, which is the nature of painful memories. But I still have very vivid memories of how the day unfolded, and mostly just the feeling of fear of being in the city and not knowing if something worse was going to happen, and not really understanding the enormity of it. And I think, like anybody else in the city, even as a journalist, it just took me a lot of time to process what had happened. And I don't think it was for a couple of months that I really realized what had happened. I just kind of dove right into story writing mode because I had to. And that definitely had a toll. I mean, I ended that year feeling personally and professionally exhausted and sad.
Do you think, and the way you're describing it, I can't imagine any other answer, but tell us how it affected your writing. Because, again, you're a writer. You're trying to do it from a distance at an arm's length, and be objective, but it had to affect you.
Oh, it definitely did. I think it was that year, actually, that I realized that, there are two kinds of journalists out there, and there are those who can report and cover war, and there are those who can't, and I have so much respect for those who do. I realized that year that I was not a war reporter, because when I was faced with that amount of tragedy and violence and death, it was terrifying. I mean, I put on my game face and I wrote the stories, and probably what motivated me was knowing that families who had lost loved ones, just wanted to have something to hold on to at that point, and they wanted people to know about the importance of their loved ones' lives. And that was a huge responsibility for me. And I've always taken that very seriously as a journalist, which is writing about people who have lost their lives. I feel this huge amount of responsibility to write about somebody I didn't know, and to do so in a way that the people who knew him or her best feel does justice to them, so they can hold on to it for a lifetime for their children and grandchildren. And but it always affects me. It always affects me because you can feel other people's grief, and there's a part of you that's like a sponge, and I have a lot of that. I'm a very sensitive storyteller, which I think helps me in many ways because, I can let people know that I understand that I lost someone that year as well, that I understand 9/11 because I was there. These kind of things are important, I think, when you storytell, is to make yourself a real person, too.
If you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. In this segment, we're talking to Molly Knight Raskin. She is a journalist, written for everybody from the Washington Post, Psychology Today, also done some work with PBS. And we are talking specifically today about some of her experiences and specifically the work No Better Time, The Brief Remarkable Life of Danny Lewin, a genius who transformed the Internet. Well, we've kind of danced around it here, Molly, but specifically, Danny Lewin, a mathematical genius. He worked hard to create a faster, better Internet, put to the test certainly during 9/11. And tragically, a victim of 9/11. Let's turn our sights now completely onto the book. Give us again the basic background, and let's take it from there.
Well, sure. So Danny Lewin was a Israeli-American. He was born and raised in the United States. His parents decided to move to Israel when he was a teenager with their other two sons. Not really purely for religious reasons. It was more, sort of a Zionist wave of values, family values that drew them there. And Danny was, from a very young age, was extraordinarily bright, but also extraordinarily determined. And his parents saw this really early on, always pushing himself beyond what anybody asked of him, very gifted intellectually and academically, and also physically, which is sort of an unusual combination. And they moved to Israel in the 80s, and Danny proved himself very quickly to be a standout at school. He actually didn't go to school very much because he didn't find it very challenging. So he sort of sailed through school. He went on to join the Israeli army, as all native Israelis do. He felt very tied to Israel very quickly and joined the army. And he first defied the odds really when he was accepted into Israel's most elite counterterrorism unit at the age of 18 or 19. And it's almost unheard of for an American-born Israeli to be accepted into this unit. It's a very, very highly secretive, prestigious, elite unit of counterterrorism. So he trained in counterterrorism, and at a certain point he just realized that his gift for math was something he could really use and he wanted to pursue, and he was accepted to MIT on a full scholarship, left Israel for Cambridge, Massachusetts, and began at MIT in the mid-'90s, which was as you'll recall, right at the sort of cusp of the dot-com boom.
Yep.
So Danny came to MIT, and he, like all the students there, he was looking for a topic for his thesis and kind of struggling with it and a little intimidated by the intensity of the academic community there. And he came up with this idea on his own called consistent hashing. Very, very complicated mathematical concept that I won't get into for your listeners. But the basic idea of it was that he found this way using theoretical math to speed up the transmission of information on the Internet. And at the time, if you remember back in those days, you would log on to the Internet and you would hear this chirping and buzzing, and it would seem probably today like an interminable wait. And then you'd hear this message, please wait, the server's busy, come back later. That was something that was really hurting the Internet at the time. And so everybody was searching for a solution for this. How do we speed up this massive network of networks? How do we get information from A to B in a way that's more efficient? And Danny did it at age 27 using math. And that's what I loved about the story. You know, he looked somewhere where nobody else was really looking, and he used this very complex set of algorithms to program software, intelligent software, which he worked with his professor, who became his mentor and best friend at MIT, who was a little bit older than him, and they patented it and created this technology that is still in use today, and it successfully allowed the Internet to manage huge crushes of traffic at various times.
When you were researching this, how accessible was the family, and were they surprised? I remember you, again, earlier in the show, you referenced that you're wondering, why hasn't this story been told? Why don't we know about this? Which would lead me to believe that other than maybe a local newspaper or media talking to the family, just because Danny had died as a victim, did they have all the other background on this? Had they ever been asked about it before?
That's another great question. I mean, it was that was really the first big hurdle to writing this book, right? So I wasn't the first person to say this is a wonderful story, but I was the first person to go after the story with, I think, a kind of intensity that his family ended up appreciating. That's part of the reason the story had not been told earlier. I mean, first there was just respecting their own grieving process. And so in the years after 9/11, after losing their son in a horrific way, everybody dealt with it their own way. Theirs was very private and very quiet. They're very religious people, and they just didn't want to talk about it. So the story was kind of left to Danny's friends, and they did a good job of it. They tried to get it out in every way possible, and they set up scholarships in his name. And in Boston and Cambridge, they named a street after him. But, it just never had been told in its entirety, probably because that family piece was missing for some other reasons. And so the first thing I did when I started the book was to email his parents and say, I'm so inspired by what your son did, and a lot of people are so inspired by him, and I would like to write a book about him. And they were reluctant, but they agreed to meet with me. So, yeah, I pretty much got on a plane and flew to Tel Aviv from New York on sort of a whim and said, will you meet with me? And we met, And in the end, they felt that they could trust me to tell a story that was not focused, again, just on the way he died, but the way he lived and the way he inspired people to work and do great things.
The tremendous irony here of the tremendous training that he had and his dedication, and as you reference in the book, the fact that he was sitting in front of one of his killers, and at the time, of course, would be completely unaware of that.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of irony there, and it's really horrific. Danny got on Flight 11 that day, American Airlines Flight 11, which left out of Logan Airport in Boston. It was bound for Los Angeles. He had a business meeting, and, you know, he had taken that flight so many times that year that he knew the flight attendants' names. He knew some of the folks in business class. He knew, you know, the make and model of the plane. And he got on that morning just like any other morning, you know, just like anybody else. And he was working hard to keep Akamai, his company, afloat. It was sort of the bursting of the bubble time, so he was working really hard. And he got on the flight that morning and was sitting in business class. By this time, his company had made him into basically an overnight billionaire. And sadly, he really did not have any time to enjoy it, because a few months later was this morning he got on the flight, and he was seated in first class among, so it was 5 of the terrorists who hijacked the flights that day. When I looked at the flight manifest seating arrangement, I just remember chills going up my spine, because I looked at it and I realized he could have reached his arm out and touched Muhammad Atta, who was the ringleader of the attacks. And you know, for that reason, I concluded that that he must have known very early on that something was going on that plane, considering his training in the Israeli army, in this elite counterterrorism unit, and the fact that he knew conversational Arabic. And, you know, these guys were giving off some verbal cues at some point. And so he must have known very early on.
What, again, as you talk to his family and his friends, beyond what you see on the surface, and by surface I mean a very bright guy, well-traveled, well-learned, kind of Renaissance guy, anything that you learned about him that surprised you based on all that?
Well, that's kind of another reason I loved writing about him, is because every time I thought I could put my finger on him, I could encapsulate his character, I would learn something that surprised me. And that's what I loved about writing about him, is that you couldn't put him into one category or one. He had none of these sort of characteristics of, for example, a math genius, because he wasn't a nerd and he wasn't a geek. Part of him was, but part of him was also incredibly athletic and popular with the girls. You know, he was big and burly and physically extremely intimidating, and yet he played the violin beautifully, and he loved musical theater. And there were so many contradictions in his character. He was a very sweet guy, unlike a lot of, you know, today's sort of big tech CEOs who can be very demanding. He was very demanding, but also very kind. And, you know, I didn't learn a lot about him that made me not like him. The things I learned about him sort of delighted and surprised me along the way.
What about, and again, you have been in the journalism game for a long, long time. You've chosen this particular story, and I know you are very sensitive to the fact that a lot of people lost their lives that day, and one's no more important than the other. Do you think, Molly, if you looked at that manifest, as you mentioned earlier, you'd find stories that are not necessarily Danny's story, but one that are just as fascinating?
Well, to your point, I mean, I have no doubt, and everybody's story of that day, I believe, not only deserves to be told, but should be told, because everybody was a hero in their own way that day. I mean, everybody struggled in their own way in those last moments, and you know, everybody contributed something to this world. I mean, I spent the weeks after 9/11 just sitting on the subway making myself read the New York Times Portraits of Grief, where they outlined the lives of every single person lost that day in these paragraphs. And so, yes, I think it's so important to remember every single person from that day, and there are extraordinary stories to be told. And some of them who were on the flight with Danny, their stories have been told. But I will say that, you know, again, what I found spectacular, though, and worthy of a book about Danny was that was just the end of his life. That was 47 minutes at the end of a 31-year life during which he accomplished these things that were almost fiction-like. They were so spectacular. And so it was a joy to write about somebody who yes, it was a tragic ending and he perished that day, and yet he has this incredible legacy that lives on in people who are really changing the world through technology. And that, to me, was an opportunity to inspire young people who are, toiling away on a PhD thesis they think no one will ever read. Danny felt that at some point, and he built a billion-dollar company out of it. So, or even a young soldier, who thinks, I may never rise up in the ranks. You actually can. And so that was really what pushed me to tell this story in more detail than perhaps some of the other stories have been shared from that horrible day.
Again, we're with Molly Knight Raskin, journalist extraordinaire, has written for numerous publications and also has a couple of PBS documentaries to her credit. We're talking about No Better Time, the brief, remarkable life of Danny Lewin, the genius who transformed the Internet. Molly, as we start to kind of wind down here just a little bit, maybe the lessons are several, but as a journalist, if you were to describe your book to a classroom of students, what would you describe or suggest maybe the lesson or the big, huge, as we say, takeaway was from the work?
Sure. Well, I think there are a couple, but, the one that really, for me is the most important is, and this gets to the title of the book, which a lot of people ask me about. It's the idea of time, and, an incredible thing about Danny was this fact that at such a young age he seemed aware of the fact that time doesn't wait for anybody. I mean, he never, sort of sat there and was really morose over, what if I don't have as much time as another person? Or he looked at it in this really positive way. Our time is short. We have a chance to contribute. Tap into your talents. But more importantly, do something and don't listen to the naysayers, to the challengers, to the people who put you down, the people who say you can't do it. And he had this uncanny ability also to tune those people out. And sometimes they were right. There were things that he couldn't do. But a lot of things he did, he defied the odds, and he didn't listen, and he pushed forward and had a lot of faith in his own ability. And I do think that the takeaway for any young person or older person reading the book is that, people can tell you all sorts of things about what you can and can't do. But, we all have this life to live, and we can contribute so much if we don't fall victim to our fears, to other people's perceptions of who we are. And, Danny walked through challenges like walls, and he just never seemed really fazed by what anybody else thought. And I think it goes to sort of cliches that get thrown around a lot, like carpe diem, seize the day, But rarely do we stop, though, and hear a story that sort of encompasses the importance. Those things are cliches because they're true. And then here you have this guy who lived a life like this, and tuned out the people who said he couldn't do it.
As a journalist, again, you didn't wake up one day and say, I'm going to write a story about a particular victim or about the whole events of 9/11, but such a defining moment in American history. I'm curious, again, from your perspective as a journalist, does this lead you to want to do more sort of biographical work, or to do some more exploring about 9/11 and some of the tentacles and legs into things that has?
Well, I always say I'm just always looking for my next great story, one that will move me, will inspire me, and then therefore I can inspire other people in the telling of it. I think that there's so many elements of the story that fascinated me, which was really also a delight in writing it, to be able to, jump into the world of counterterrorism training and the Israeli army and the culture there, and then to spend a lot of time in Cambridge at MIT, which was, for me, just totally electrifying. I mean, I was not a math and science person, and so being in that world and having this massive learning curve for me was also very exciting. So, again, I don't know necessarily about that day, but maybe because I've written a book about a victim and an untold story, another one will come to me that is equally inspiring. I just don't know, but I always pursue any little kernel of a story that I'm interested in with a lot of enthusiasm, and I just hope more come my way. I almost regretted finishing the book for as much as I cursed the workload and managing life and family. While I was writing it, I was almost sad to leave it because the bulk of the book, again, is about his life and this extraordinary way he lived, and it was very inspiring to write about. It made me feel a little bit lazy at times.
Again, as we wrap up here, the work is No Better Time by Molly Knight Raskin, published by Da Capo Press. Hey, Molly, probably know this, but how can we get a copy of the book, and also how can we find out some more about the story and some of the other work that you've done?
Oh, well, thank you for asking. Yeah, fortunately, it's all available online. The book is being sold at all major booksellers, so Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, and hopefully your local bookstore has a copy of No Better Time. And you can find all the information you need on my website, which is just my full name, MollyKnightRaskin.com. And there I've got a list of, a lot of the other work I've done in print and documentary film, and also information about how you can order the book.
Well, thank you so much for spending part of your day with us. It is a tremendous, poignant, inspiring story in many ways, and appreciate, again, your time and sharing with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been such a delightful conversation and a real pleasure to be on.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.